The underworld, where power is not granted by law but seized through money and violence. When it comes to organized crime, the two most dominant forces are the American Mafia and the Mexican Cartel. One controls politics and the economy from the shadows. The other rules with guns, engaging in direct confrontation with the government. But who is truly more terrifying? The Mafia, master manipulators of power, or the Cartel, warriors willing to shoot down military helicopters? And if one day both were to disappear, who would rise next? The truth may not be what you think. Let's find out. All criminal organizations share one common trait. They do not emerge naturally but are born from specific social and historical circumstances. No country is entirely free of crime, but the way crime develops depends on various factors: culture, politics, economy, and the state's ability to maintain order. When examining the American Mafia and the Mexican Cartel, one fascinating detail stands out. Both grew from government weakness and the demands of the underground market. Yet their paths were entirely different. In the United States, the Mafia emerged from Italian, Irish, and Jewish immigrant communities, people who arrived with dreams of a better life but found themselves marginalized by society. With no government protection and limited economic opportunities, they created their own rules. In Mexico, however, cartels did not originate from impoverished street gangs but from agricultural and transportation magnates who quickly realized that drug trafficking was far more profitable than any other industry. Two different paths, two different evolutions, but in the end, both became formidable forces, not just domestically but on a global scale. The American Mafia once haunted the United States, but today, the Mexican Cartel dominates the underworld. Why is that? What happened? And will the cartel follow the same trajectory as the Mafia? Everything began in the early 20th century. The American Mafia was never a single entity but a complex system of multiple crime families operating under a family business model. The first gangs appeared in New York and Chicago, where Italian immigrants brought their mafia traditions from home. However, the Mafia truly exploded in power when the U.S. enacted the Prohibition Act, 1920 to 1933. During this time, bootlegging became an extremely lucrative business, and the Mafia quickly took control of the entire black market. Imagine a country where alcohol is completely banned, yet the demand remains. Who steps in to fill the void? The Mafia. Underground bars flourished, police officers were bribed, and politicians benefited from massive payoffs. The Mafia, once a collection of small street gangs, transformed into massive criminal enterprises, controlling America's underground economy. However, what stood out most was how the Mafia operated. Unlike the Mexican cartels that later resorted to blatant violence, the Mafia built an unspoken code of conduct known as Omerta, the Code of Silence. No one could betray the organization. No one could cooperate with the police. And breaking this rule meant an inevitable death. The Mafia functioned like a secretive business empire, where everything was tightly controlled, leaving no traces behind. This strategy allowed them to survive for decades. But then, everything changed. While the American Mafia thrived by controlling alcohol smuggling, the Mexican cartels had a different foundation: drugs. Mexico never had alcohol prohibition, but it did share a long border with the U.S., the world's largest drug consumer. This made Mexico the perfect gateway for smuggling. However, it wasn't until the 1980s, when the U.S. declared war on Colombian cartels, that the Mexican cartels truly exploded in power. Previously, most cocaine reached the U.S. directly from Colombia via air routes. But as the U.S. cracked down on these operations, Colombian traffickers were forced to find alternative smuggling methods, and Mexico became the perfect partner. Mexican cartels transitioned from mere transporters to full-scale producers, controllers, and industry leaders. Unlike the American Mafia, Mexican cartels had no code of honor or silence. They operated like military units, eliminating anyone in their way: police officers, journalists, and even politicians. While the Mafia used money to manipulate governments, the cartels used both money and firepower. Another key difference was their organizational structure. The American Mafia followed a clear hierarchy. Boss, Don, the ultimate decision-maker. Underboss, manages day-to-day operations. Capo regime, captain, oversees smaller crews. Soldier, carries out tasks. In contrast, Mexican cartels functioned more like an army, with distinct divisions for each task. Transportation unit, smuggles drugs across the border. Assassination unit, eliminates traitors and rivals. Financial unit, launders money and manages profits. Political unit, bribes police and government officials. This structure made Mexican cartels significantly stronger because they were not dependent on a single leader. When a mafia boss was arrested, his entire organization could collapse. But when a cartel leader was eliminated, dozens of replacements were ready to take over. This was the fatal weakness of the American Mafia. So why did the Mafia decline while the cartels grew stronger? And what will happen next? Money is the backbone of any criminal organization. Without money, there is no power. Without power, there is no existence. However, the way the American Mafia and the Mexican cartel generate income reflects the core nature of each organization. If the American Mafia operates like a financial conglomerate, carefully investing in legitimate businesses to launder money, the Mexican cartel functions like a war machine, making money at all costs, regardless of violence and destruction. The question is, between these two methods, which is more effective? Let's start with the American Mafia. After the Prohibition era ended, the Mafia no longer had a monopoly on bootlegging, but instead of collapsing, they adapted and expanded into other lucrative industries, particularly those with weak legal oversight. One of the most profitable ventures was gambling. Las Vegas, once a barren desert, became a casino paradise, not because of the government, but because of the Mafia. They invested in casinos, laundered money through gamblers, and controlled the entire cash flow of the city. Notably, instead of directly confronting the authorities, the Mafia cooperated with officials, sharing profits in exchange for protection. This was a key difference from the Mexican cartels. The Mafia didn't want war with the state, they wanted to become a part of the system. But gambling was only a small piece of the puzzle. From the 1950s to the 1980s, the American Mafia nearly monopolized the entire underground economy in the US. They controlled labor unions. From construction to transportation, a company seeking a major contract? They had to bribe the Mafia. A business wanting to avoid trouble with unions? They had to pay protection fees. Even Hollywood was not exempt, as major film productions had to rely on Mafia security services to prevent sabotage or attacks. At its peak in the 1970s, reports suggested that over 80% of construction contracts in New York were under Mafia control. However, drugs remained the biggest revenue stream. The Mafia did not directly produce drugs, but they controlled the supply chain. In the 1980s, as demand for heroin and cocaine skyrocketed in the US, the Mafia acted as a middleman, purchasing drugs from Colombian cartels and distributing them through street gangs like the Bloods, Crips, and Latin Kings. This highlights a crucial difference. The American Mafia never exposed itself too much in the drug trade. If someone got arrested, it was always the street-level dealers. The higher up the chain, the harder it was to trace. This strategy allowed the Mafia to survive for decades. The Mexican cartel operates differently. They don't act as intermediaries. They control the entire supply chain from A to Z. They no longer purchase drugs from Colombia, they grow, produce, transport, and distribute everything themselves. This means that every gram of cocaine sold generates maximum profit, without having to share with anyone. And to protect this revenue stream, the cartel relies on extreme violence. If the Mafia manipulated officials with financial power, the cartel uses both money and bullets. Imagine a cartel boss commanding a private army, thousands of trained gunmen equipped with machine guns, armored vehicles, and even drones. This is no longer just an ordinary criminal gang. It is a militarized organization with firepower rivaling national armies. Unlike the American Mafia, which bribed officials discreetly, the cartel gives government figures two clear choices: take the money or take the bullet. But drugs are not the cartel's only business. One of their most lucrative operations is human trafficking. Every year, hundreds of thousands of Central American migrants attempt to cross into the U.S., and most must pay protection fees to the cartel. If they refuse, they risk being murdered or sold into sex trafficking rings. A recent report estimates that Mexican cartels generate over $10 billion annually from human smuggling alone. This is a stable revenue source, because no matter how strict U.S. border policies become, migrants will always seek ways to cross, and the cartel will always be there to collect payment. The cartel's reach extends even further. They illegally extract oil from national pipelines and sell it on the black market. In some areas, they illegally mine precious minerals or force farmers to grow poppy plants instead of traditional crops. For the cartel, anything that can generate money must be controlled. Unlike the American Mafia, which needed front businesses, restaurants, hotels, legal companies, to launder money, the Mexican cartel operates an international money laundering network. Through banks, commercial companies, and even cryptocurrency, they can send money to China, have it cleaned, and then funnel it back to Mexico, leaving virtually no trace. This is why, despite hundreds of cartel members being arrested every year, their cash flow remains uninterrupted. The American Mafia was smarter, more cautious, and embedded itself into the legal economy. But the Mexican cartel has absolute power. Using extreme force to silence opposition, even governments fear them. If the Mexican cartel continues evolving its money laundering techniques, could it transform into a new mafia? And if the US government successfully dismantled the American Mafia, will the Mexican cartel face the same fate? When it comes to crime, most people think of murder, smuggling, or money laundering. But what many don't realize is that organized crime doesn't just make money, it controls society. It doesn't just exist in the shadows, sometimes. It holds power on par with the government. The American Mafia once manipulated politics by controlling the underground economy, while Mexican cartels openly challenge the authorities with brute force. But between these two methods, which one is truly more terrifying? Looking at history, the American Mafia was once a significant underground force in US politics. They didn't assassinate politicians in broad daylight like the cartels, but they had other ways of achieving power. One of the most famous examples is the 1960 US presidential election, where evidence suggests that Joseph Kennedy, the father of John F. Kennedy, collaborated with the Mafia to help his son win. No one can confirm this 100%, but if it were true, it would mean that one of America's most important presidents had backing from the underworld. The way the Mafia controls politics is not through open violence but through sophisticated manipulation. They don't need to show their faces, they just need to control the right people. If a politician can be bribed, they use money to gain influence. If bribery doesn't work, they destroy that person's reputation with scandals or subtle threats. The Mafia understands that controlling society isn't about killing, it's about controlling the decision-makers. This is entirely different from the Mexican cartels. Cartels don't bribe politicians with lavish parties or lucrative contracts like the Mafia. They offer two simple choices: take the money or take the bullet. This is what makes Mexican cartels far more terrifying than the Mafia. If a politician refuses to cooperate, there's a high chance they'll be shot dead on the street the next day. One of the most striking examples was the 2018 election in Mexico, when at least 130 politicians were assassinated for refusing to work with the cartels. Among them were candidates who were killed immediately after announcing their campaigns. This wasn't an indirect threat, it was a public warning that no one could stay outside the cartel's rules. What's even more frightening is that cartels don't just kill politicians, they control entire local governments. In many parts of Mexico, local police don't actually work for the government, they work for the cartels. If a kidnapping occurs, citizens don't call the police because they know the police won't help them. Instead, sometimes, it's the police themselves who hand over information to the cartels. So what creates this difference? Why can the American Mafia infiltrate politics so subtly while Mexican cartels rely on overt violence? The answer lies in their goals. The American Mafia wants to be part of the system. They don't want to fight the government, they want to cooperate and control it from within. When the mafia controls a mayor or a senator, they don't ask them to do outrageous things. They simply ensure that the mafia's operations continue unimpeded. This allows them to maintain power for a long time without being completely eradicated by the government. Mexican cartels are different. They don't care about maintaining the system, they want to create their own system. In some regions, cartels don't even need the government anymore, they set their own rules, deciding who lives and who dies. They don't need the government's cooperation because they have replaced the government. One of the clearest examples of this was the war between the Mexican government and the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, CJNG, in 2015. When the Mexican military attempted to eliminate a CJNG leader, the cartel retaliated by shooting down a military helicopter, killing several soldiers. This was no longer just a criminal organization. It was a private army capable of directly confronting the government. But here's an interesting point. Even though Mexican cartels are stronger than the American mafia in terms of military power, when it comes to societal manipulation, the mafia still holds an important advantage. Because the mafia operates in secrecy, they have survived for decades without being completely dismantled by the government. In contrast, the cartels flaunt their power so openly that authorities are forced to crack down on them. Look at the American mafia. Even though the FBI dismantled many mafia organizations in the 1980s and 1990s, the mafia didn't disappear. They simply became more sophisticated, shifting to more legal activities like money laundering through real estate, controlling the financial sector, and investing in legitimate businesses. On the other hand, Mexican cartels are too strong, too violent, and too blatant. This makes them a constant target for both the US and Mexican governments. And this raises an important question. Are the cartels following the same path as the American mafia? Will they eventually have to go underground and operate more discreetly to avoid being wiped out? Some experts believe that cartels are slowly adapting and becoming more sophisticated. They are building money laundering networks through international banks, investing in legal businesses, just as the mafia did before them. But will this be enough for them to survive long-term? Or will they be eradicated before they have the chance to evolve? The underworld doesn't just exist in reality, it also has a strong presence in the public imagination. But what's interesting is that the way we perceive crime isn't entirely dictated by truth. It's shaped by the media. Think about it. When we mention the American mafia, what comes to mind? Sophisticated men in expensive suits, sitting in elegant restaurants, making ruthless decisions while maintaining a composed demeanor. And when we talk about Mexican cartels, what images appear? Masked gunmen spraying bullets chaotically, gruesome torture videos circulating on social media, battlefields littered with corpses. Why is it that, despite both being organized crime groups, the American mafia is romanticized while Mexican cartels are portrayed as uncontrollable monsters? The answer lies in how the media tells their stories. And the question is, do we truly know the reality? Or are we only seeing what the media wants us to see? Let's start with the American mafia. If we look at the history of cinema, from The Godfather to Goodfellas, from The Sopranos to The Irishman, all of these films depict the mafia in a way that is almost humanizing. We don't see them as ruthless killers but as underground businessmen, intelligent men with principles, even strong family values. But let's face reality, the mafia was never as noble as the movies make them seem. From the 1920s to the 1980s, the American mafia controlled the entire underground economy of the US, from gambling and drugs to money laundering and political intimidation. They eliminated anyone who stood in their way and manipulated the economy. So why didn't the media depict them as bloodthirsty criminals? One reason is that the mafia had deep connections with American elites and politicians. And these relationships allowed them to control how they were portrayed in the media. When the mafia was at its peak, no one dared to openly criticize them. And when they started to decline, Hollywood transformed them into cultural icons rather than the ruthless criminals they truly were. Now, let's turn to the Mexican cartels. Unlike the American mafia, cartels are never portrayed in films as powerful gentlemen. Instead, what we see in the news and on television is horror, corpses hanging from bridges, brutal executions, daylight shootouts. While the American mafia is romanticized, Mexican cartels are depicted as a societal plague that must be eradicated. But have you ever wondered, are Mexican cartels truly more terrifying than the American Mafia? Or has the media simply made them seem that way? The story gets even more intriguing when we examine how the cartels themselves use the media to shape their image. They don't need Hollywood to build their reputation, they create their own image through social media. Let's talk about narco-corridos, a popular genre of music in Mexico where songs are composed to glorify cartel leaders as heroes. These songs celebrate their wealth, power, and bravery. To some people in Mexico, cartels aren't monsters, they are modern-day Robin Hoods, challenging a corrupt government to reclaim power. But cartels don't stop at music. They use social media in ways that no other criminal organization has before. While the American Mafia once avoided cameras and journalists, Mexican cartels actively spread violent content on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and even TikTok. For cartels, media isn't just a tool for building an image, it's a psychological weapon. Imagine you're a Mexican police officer. One day, you open Twitter and see a video. A group of fellow officers executed by a cartel. Their deaths recorded in detail. What would you do? Continue fighting them or choose the safer option, staying silent or even cooperating? This is how cartels use media to spread fear, something the American Mafia never did. If the Mafia used silence to maintain power, the cartels use public displays of violence to create power. And here's something to think about. What if the American Mafia had access to media like the cartels do today? Would they still be romanticized as they are now? Or would they be seen as monsters too? But there's an even bigger issue. Do we really know who controls this narrative? There's something people often overlook. The media can be used as a political tool to shape public perception. When the US wanted to dismantle the Mafia, they used the FBI, the police, and the media to attack the Mafia's image. When they wanted to target the Mexican cartels, they used the press to depict them as uncontrollable terrorists. But this raises an even bigger question. Are we being manipulated into seeing the underworld the way some powerful force wants us to? Imagine if one day, Mexican cartels disappeared. Who would the media focus on next? A new organization? A new threat? Or a force that has always existed but has never been exposed by the media? We don't have the answer yet. But one thing is certain. The underworld doesn't just exist in reality. It exists in how we are taught to perceive it. The ultimate question remains. Who is truly more terrifying, the American Mafia or the Mexican cartels? We've seen the American Mafia operate for decades, silently controlling the economy and politics without leaving a trace. We've also witnessed the Mexican cartels rise like a war machine, ready to shoot down military helicopters if necessary. But the story doesn't end there. What's truly frightening isn't their existence but how they adapt and evolve to survive. The Mafia once controlled everything. But when the US government changed its strategy and dismantled crime families one by one, they were forced to retreat into the shadows, shifting to less conspicuous activities like finance, real estate, and high-tech industries. They didn't die, they transformed. Are the Mexican cartels on the same path? If one day violence is no longer sustainable, will they evolve into a new kind of mafia, more sophisticated and even more dangerous? History seems to be repeating itself. In the 1980s, the American Mafia was at its peak, only to be taken down by the US government. Now, the Mexican cartels are at their peak, but pressure from the US and the Mexican government is increasing. Will the cartels be eradicated just like the Mafia was? And if that happens, who will rise next? Let's examine how the US government deals with these organizations. Against the Mafia, the US used legal tactics, implementing laws like RICO to dismantle entire crime networks and crush union corruption. But against the cartels, the approach is entirely different. The US can't just arrest a few cartel leaders and expect the problem to disappear because cartels don't operate like tight-knit crime families. They function as sprawling military networks with dozens of factions. Arrest one leader, and another immediately takes his place. This raises an important question. Does the government even want to eliminate the cartels? If the cartels disappeared, where would the billions of dollars from drug trafficking go? Would banks, Money launderers and corrupt officials want to lose such a lucrative income source? Or are the cartels merely a part of a much larger game? A cog in a system that even governments can't, or don't want to, fully control? Looking at the global underground economy, it's clear that this isn't just a story about the American mafia or the Mexican cartels. Organized crime exists everywhere: the triads in China, the Yakuza in Japan, the Bratva in Russia, the Ndrangheta in Italy. They operate differently, but they all share one thing: they always find a way to survive and grow, even when governments attempt to destroy them. What's even more fascinating is how society perceives these organizations. Why can the Italian mafia be portrayed in legendary films and become cultural icons, while the Mexican cartels are seen only as bloodthirsty monsters? Why can the Yakuza in Japan operate openly without being completely dismantled, while the Mexican government continuously wages military campaigns against the cartels? Is this just about crime? Or is it about who controls the narrative of crime? Let's consider the role of the media. For decades, Hollywood has painted the American mafia as underground businessmen, men with principles and honor. Meanwhile, the Mexican cartels are portrayed as uncontrollable beasts. This leads to a crucial question: do we truly know who is the most dangerous? Or are we only seeing the world through the lens that someone wants us to see? But suppose one day, the Mexican cartels vanish. Who would replace them? If there's a power vacuum, who would step in? A new crime syndicate? A political force? If the American mafia was taken down but never truly disappeared, just adapted, will the cartels do the same? There's another possibility that few consider. Crime could be evolving into something far more dangerous than either the mafia or the cartels: cybercrime. In today's world, power isn't just about guns or money, it's about data and information. If traditional crime organizations are being squeezed, could they shift to a new domain where they don't need to kill to get what they want, where all it takes is a click? Imagine a future where the mafia no longer controls casinos or drug rings but dominates tech corporations, financial systems, and cryptocurrency, where the cartels no longer need to smuggle drugs across borders because they can generate billions by manipulating financial markets, stealing data, or controlling global information flows. So who really controls this world? Governments? Criminals? Or something we haven't even considered yet? If history has taught us anything, it's this: crime never disappears, it only changes form. The mafia evolved, the cartels are adapting, and the next generation of the underworld may not rely on guns or drugs, but on something far more dangerous: information and financial power. So here's the final question for you. Are we truly living in a world controlled by governments? Or are we living in a world where unseen forces have already decided our fate? The answer? Perhaps no one dares to say it aloud. But if you look closely enough, you might start to see what very few have ever realized. American mafia or Mexican cartels? Who is truly more dangerous? A manipulator in the shadows? A ruler by the gun? Or an emerging criminal force we have yet to see? If history has taught us anything, it's this: crime never disappears, it only changes shape to survive. So, what do you think? Which force truly controls the world? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on deep dives into the underworld. Because sometimes, the truth isn't always what we are led to believe.